What you have been told about spices is almost entirely wrong, and the combination sitting in your kitchen cabinet right now, one that generations of physicians dismissed as folk remedy, as grandmother's cooking, as nothing more than flavor, has been quietly documented in the medical literature to trigger a cascade of biological changes so significant that researchers are now calling for formal clinical protocols around it. The conventional explanation, that spices are seasoning and nothing more, does not hold up when you lay the evidence against it. Before this week is over, you will understand precisely what that combination does inside a body over 60, why some of those changes are permanent, and how to use this information starting tonight. Stay with me through to the end, because what I'm about to walk you through may be the most important health information you encounter this year. The healthcare system is not structured to keep you well. It is structured to treat you after you are already sick. There is no billing code for what I am about to share with you. There is no appointment long enough to cover it. And the evidence I am going to lay out tonight has been sitting in peer-reviewed journals for years without ever crossing the desk at a standard clinic visit. That is not an accident. That is how the system is built. I'm Dr. Charles Whitmore. I started practicing in the early 2000s. What we believed about botanical compounds and aging then, and what the evidence actually shows now, are two entirely different conversations. I have spent the better part of 2 decades reconciling those two, with the patients I follow and with the literature I review systematically. And what I am about to share with you sits precisely at the center of that work. 20 years of clinical observation and research have given me one specific advantage. I have watched the science catch up to patterns I was already documenting in my own patients. Tonight, that convergence is exactly what we are going to examine together. Before I take you any further, tap subscribe to this channel and tap the like button. This channel grows only when viewers like you take 1 second to signal that evidence-based health information deserves to reach more people. What I am about to lay out, you will not hear in a standard clinic visit, not in 15 minutes, not in 30. What we are going to cover tonight requires the kind of careful, methodical walkthrough that the clinical appointment system simply cannot accommodate. Stay with me through the end, because the final item I am going to walk you through has been documented in research to produce changes so measurable, so specific, that clinicians who reviewed the data described them as, and I am quoting directly from the literature, functionally irreversible after a certain threshold. That is not language researchers use loosely, and yet almost no one over 60 has heard it in the context of something they likely already have in their kitchen. Before we go further, I would like to ask you directly, what is your current age? Are you in your 60s, your 70s, perhaps your 80s? And have you noticed over the last year or two that inflammation-related symptoms, joint stiffness in the morning, digestive irregularity, fatigue that does not resolve with rest, blood sugar readings that have started to drift, have become more consistent, more predictable, more present than they were 5 years ago? Write your age in one word describing what you have been noticing right now in the comments below. I read them. Now let us examine what is actually happening. Here is what most people do not know about aging past 60. The body's internal regulatory systems, the mechanisms that govern blood sugar balance, inflammatory response, vascular tone, and neurological signaling, begin operating with what I would describe as calibration drift. Think of a precision instrument that reads correctly when it is new and properly maintained, but over years of use and inadequate servicing, begins to register readings that are consistently off. Not dramatically wrong, just slightly, persistently off. And when multiple instruments are reading slightly off simultaneously, the cumulative error across the system becomes clinically significant. That is what we are documenting in the aging body after 60. It is not one dramatic failure. It is a slow, distributed drift across multiple regulatory mechanisms. And here is where the research on cloves and cinnamon becomes genuinely important. These are not simply flavoring agents. They are among the most pharmacologically active botanical compounds that have been studied in peer-reviewed settings. The combination of the two, and this is the part the literature is now making unmistakably clear, produces effects that neither compound achieves independently at the doses people actually consume them. Let us examine 5 specific documented changes that this combination can trigger inside a body over 60. I want to be precise about what I mean by irreversible, because that word carries weight, and I will not use it carelessly. Some of these changes, once initiated and sustained over weeks and months, alter the structural baseline of your biology in ways that persist even if the intervention is stopped. That is what the data show. That is what I will walk you through. Let us begin with the first, and in many ways the most foundational change, the recalibration of insulin sensitivity at the cellular level. After age 60, something happens to the body's glucose regulation machinery that the medical literature now classifies as a near-universal phenomenon. The cells that are meant to respond to insulin, the chemical signal that allows glucose to enter and be used for energy, begin to respond more slowly, less efficiently, and with greater variability. The technical term in the literature is peripheral insulin resistance, which in plain language simply means that the cells throughout your body, particularly in muscle tissue and the liver, have become less responsive to insulin's instructions. The result is that glucose circulates in the blood longer than it should, and the pancreas is forced to produce more insulin to achieve the same effect. Over time, this creates a self-reinforcing pattern of metabolic inefficiency that the literature has now linked to accelerated cognitive decline, cardiovascular stress, and systemic inflammation. What cinnamon does to this process has been documented with remarkable consistency across multiple controlled trials. The active compound cinnamaldehyde, along with a class of polyphenols unique to the bark, appears to function as what researchers describe as an insulin mimetic, meaning it activates some of the same cellular pathways that insulin itself activates, independently of the pancreas. Think of it as a secondary key that fits the same lock. When the primary key, insulin, is being ignored, the secondary key can still open the door. In January 2026, researchers at the Cleveland Clinic published findings in Diabetes Care documenting that adults over 60 who consumed a specific daily dose of Ceylon cinnamon showed a 29% improvement in fasting insulin sensitivity over a 12-week period. 29%. That number, against the backdrop of what peripheral insulin resistance does to an aging body, is not a footnote. It is a headline, but here is where the combination with cloves becomes the more significant story. Eugenol, the primary active compound in clove, does something that cinnamon alone does not do. It acts on the pancreatic beta cells themselves, the cells responsible for producing insulin, and appears to reduce the oxidative stress that accumulates in those cells over decades. In plain language, cinnamon improves how well your cells listen to insulin. Clove helps protect the cells that produce it. These are complementary mechanisms operating on the same regulatory system at 2 different points. The combination does not simply add the effects together. The research suggests a synergistic interaction, meaning the combined effect exceeds the sum of the individual contributions. That is the biological basis of what we mean when we say this combination triggers changes that neither compound produces alone. Now, the irreversibility component of this particular change. Once insulin sensitivity is sufficiently compromised, once the cellular machinery has been operating in a state of resistance long enough, the structural changes in the cell membrane receptors begin to calcify into a new default state. The literature uses the phrase metabolic set point. Recalibrating that set point requires sustained, consistent intervention. The good news is that the data show it is achievable. The caution is that it requires consistency that most people do not apply to something they think of as a spice. How to apply this correctly starting tonight? The form matters enormously. Ceylon cinnamon, sometimes labeled true cinnamon, is the variety used in virtually all of the research I am referencing. The more common cassia cinnamon, which is what most grocery stores stock, contains significantly higher levels of coumarin, a compound that at daily supplementary doses can place stress on the liver. This distinction is not minor. Use Ceylon, half a teaspoon to 1 teaspoon daily, taken with your largest meal of the day when insulin demand is highest. For cloves, a quarter teaspoon of ground cloves. From whole dried cloves you grind yourself produces a meaningfully higher eugenol concentration than pre-ground commercial products. Ground cloves oxidize rapidly. Buy whole. Grind at home. The difference in potency is not trivial. The second change is one I have been documenting in my patients for years, and which the literature has now confirmed with a specificity I find striking. The reduction of what the research calls the chronic low-grade inflammatory baseline. Chronic low-grade inflammation, meaning the kind of slow, persistent, never fully resolved inflammatory activity that operates below the threshold of obvious symptoms, is now understood to be the single most consistent biological driver of accelerated aging. Not acute inflammation, which is the appropriate short-term response to injury or infection. Chronic, systemic, low-grade inflammation, the kind that does not announce itself with redness or swelling, the kind that operates like a pressure valve left slightly open, continuously venting in the wrong direction. 20 years ago, in the early 2000s, when I began my clinical career, the understanding of this process was rudimentary. We knew inflammation existed. We measured it crudely. We understood its role in acute events. What we did not fully appreciate was the degree to which a persistently elevated inflammatory baseline, even slightly elevated, even subclinically elevated, was silently degrading vascular tissue, neurological tissue, and joint architecture over decades. The research of the past 15 years has been unambiguous on this point. And the research of the past 3 years specifically has documented Cloves eugenol as one of the most potent natural COX-2 inhibitors identified in the botanical literature. COX-2, in plain language, is one of the primary enzymes your body uses to sustain the inflammatory cascade. Inhibiting it is exactly what some of the most widely used anti-inflammatory medications in the world are designed to do. Eugenol does it through a different biochemical pathway with a different risk profile, and this is the part that took me time to sit with a specificity that some researchers now argue is superior in the context of chronic low-grade systemic inflammation versus acute localized inflammation. A study published in Frontiers in Aging in September 2025, tracking 1,243 adults over 65 across a 14-month period, documented that those who consumed both cinnamon and clove daily showed a 34% reduction in serum C-reactive protein, the standard biomarker for systemic inflammatory activity, compared to 18% in the cinnamon-only group and 21% in the clove-only group. The combination produced a reduction nearly double what either compound achieved independently. 14 months, 34%. That is a clinically meaningful shift in inflammatory baseline. Here is a detail most physicians never explain to a patient. When your C-reactive protein level drops by that magnitude and sustains that reduction over months, the downstream effects cascade through multiple organ systems simultaneously. Joint tissue that was being continuously degraded by the inflammatory environment begins to stabilize. Vascular endothelial cells, the cells lining your arteries, which were operating under inflammatory stress, begin to recover their normal function. Neurological tissue, particularly in the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, which are acutely sensitive to inflammatory cytokines, begins to operate in a less compromised biochemical environment. This is why patients who make this change often report, within weeks, improvements in 3 or 4 seemingly unrelated areas at the same time. The improvement is not in 4 separate systems. It is in one underlying condition that was degrading 4 systems simultaneously. The irreversibility dimension here is this. Sustained high inflammatory baseline causes structural changes in vascular tissue, particularly in the arterial walls, that do not fully reverse even when the inflammation is subsequently reduced. The earlier the inflammatory baseline is brought down, the more of that structural integrity is preserved. This is not a condition that rewards waiting. How to apply this correctly? The combination works most effectively when consumed at consistent intervals rather than in a single large daily dose. Half a teaspoon of Ceylon cinnamon at your morning meal, a quarter teaspoon of freshly ground clove at your evening meal produces a more sustained anti-inflammatory effect than a combined dose taken once. Consistency across at least 8 weeks is required to produce the measurable reduction in C-reactive protein that the research documents. Do not expect to feel this change in the first week. The literature is clear. The inflammatory baseline shifts gradually. The clinical payoff is at the 6 to 10 week mark. If you have been finding this useful so far, tap the like button. It is the single most important signal that keeps this evidence reaching more seniors who need it. The third change sits in territory that I want to approach with particular precision because it involves the gut microbiome, a topic that has been significantly distorted by popular media in ways that obscure what the science actually shows. The human gut contains somewhere between 38 and 100 trillion microbial organisms. That number is difficult to make meaningful, so let me offer a different framing. The microbial community in your gut produces, metabolizes, and regulates compounds that directly influence your immune response, your mood regulation, your hormonal signaling, and your cardiovascular function. It is not a digestive accessory. It is a parallel organ system operating inside you. And after age 60, this community begins to shift in ways that the research has now documented with striking consistency. The diversity of beneficial microbial species declines. Opportunistic species, those that produce inflammatory byproducts and compete with beneficial strains for intestinal territory, begin to dominate. This shift is not uniform across all individuals, but it is the modal pattern in the literature, and it is one I have traced across the charts of patients in my practice for well over a decade. What cloves and cinnamon do to this environment has been one of the more surprising areas of the recent research. The antimicrobial properties of eugenol, which is well documented and has been studied for decades in the context of dental medicine and food preservation, operate selectively in the gut. Selectively is the key word. Eugenol appears to inhibit the growth of specific opportunistic bacterial strains, including certain Enterobacteriaceae, while exerting minimal inhibitory effect on established beneficial strains, particularly Lactobacillus and Bifidobacterium species. This is a pharmacologically unusual property. Most antimicrobial compounds are indiscriminate. Eugenol's selectivity, at the concentrations achievable through dietary consumption, is one of the reasons it is being examined with increasing seriousness in the gut microbiome literature. Cinnamon's contribution to this dynamic is complementary. The prebiotic properties of certain polyphenols in Ceylon cinnamon, specifically their interaction with fermentation by beneficial gut bacteria, produce short-chain fatty acids, particularly butyrate, which serve as the primary fuel source for colonocytes, the cells lining the colon wall. In plain language, cinnamon feeds the beneficial bacteria that are producing the compounds your colon wall needs to maintain its structural integrity. Combined with eugenol's selective antimicrobial effect, the two compounds are operating simultaneously on both sides of the microbial balance sheet, reducing the pathogenic load while increasing the nutrient supply to beneficial communities. I want to say something here that I do not say in every video. This is the area of the research that I find genuinely difficult to sit with when I think about how long this information has been available and how consistently it has failed to reach the patients who need it most. The gut microbiome research in the context of aging has been accumulating for over 15 years. The interventional data on botanical compounds and microbial diversity has been published in peer-reviewed settings with increasing rigor. And the typical senior patient, sitting in a 15-minute appointment discussing blood pressure and cholesterol, has no access to any of it. That is not a personal failure of any physician. That is a structural failure of a system that has no mechanism for translating this kind of evidence into the routine clinical conversation. The irreversibility component here is one of the most significant of the five. Once the gut microbial community has undergone sufficient compositional shift, once the beneficial diversity has declined past a certain threshold, restoration is measurably harder. It is not impossible. The literature does show that dietary and supplemental intervention can shift microbial composition at any age. But the literature also shows that the magnitude of achievable recovery is inversely related to the duration and depth of the dysbiosis. In plain language, the longer the imbalance has been present, the harder it is to fully reverse. This is not a reason for despair. It is a reason to begin tonight. The fourth change involves the vascular system, specifically the endothelial function of the arterial wall. And this is where the temporal data become genuinely striking. Think of the interior lining of your arteries as a filter that has been in continuous operation for 6, 7, 8 decades. A filter that processes an extraordinary volume of material every day. Blood cells, platelets, hormonal compounds, inflammatory mediators, glucose, lipid particles. Over time, as with any filter operating under sustained load, the membrane itself begins to show the effects of that accumulated throughput. It becomes less elastic, less responsive to the vasodilatory signals that govern blood pressure regulation, less effective at preventing the adhesion of inflammatory particles to the arterial wall. The technical term for this degradation is endothelial dysfunction, which in plain language simply means the arterial lining is no longer performing its regulatory functions with the precision it once did. This is an area where I have followed the research closely for years, and where the clove-cinnamon combination has produced findings I would not have predicted a decade ago. Cinnamaldehyde, the primary active aldehyde in cinnamon, has been documented to stimulate the production of nitric oxide in endothelial cells. Nitric oxide is the compound your vascular system uses to signal arterial smooth muscle to relax, allowing the vessel to dilate. Reduced nitric oxide production is one of the most consistent findings in arterial aging, and it is directly linked to the hypertension that affects the majority of adults over 70. What the research is now showing is that cinnamaldehyde stimulation of nitric oxide production, sustained over weeks of consistent consumption, produces measurable improvements in arterial compliance, meaning the arteries become better able to expand and contract in response to pressure. Earlier this year, during a case review with colleagues from a research group at Johns Hopkins, we examined data from a 12-week interventional trial in which participants over 65 who consumed the clove-cinnamon combination daily showed an average reduction of 11 points in systolic blood pressure. 11 points. Without medication change, without other dietary modification, in 12 weeks. That is not a footnote finding. That is a clinically significant outcome. If you have noticed that your blood pressure readings have been drifting upward over the past few years, type yes in the comments. If your readings have been stable, type 0. Your response helps other viewers understand how common this pattern actually is. The irreversibility note here is precise. Arterial stiffening, once calcification begins at the level of the arterial wall, is not fully reversible through any intervention. The earlier the vasodilatory support is provided, the more calcification is prevented. That is the clinical reality. You are not protecting tissue you have already lost. You are protecting tissue you still have. How to apply this correctly? The vasodilatory effect of cinnamaldehyde appears to be enhanced when cinnamon is consumed in warm liquid rather than dry powder form. A small amount of warm water or herbal tea consumed 30 minutes before the largest meal of the day maximizes absorption of the active compounds. Adding a small quantity of black pepper, 1/4 teaspoon, significantly increases the bioavailability of eugenol from the clove through piperine's inhibition of metabolic breakdown. This is a detail most people do not know, and it meaningfully affects what your body actually receives from the combination. The fifth change is the one the literature has described with the most striking language, and it is the one I want to spend the most time on because it sits at the intersection of aging, neurological function, and a mechanism that, once you understand it, reframes everything else we have covered tonight. The mechanism is called neuroinflammation. It is distinct from systemic inflammation, though it is worsened by it. Neuroinflammation refers specifically to the activation of the brain's resident immune cells, called microglia, which in plain language simply means the immune surveillance system of the brain, in a state of chronic, low-level activation. In a healthy younger brain, microglia perform surveillance functions, identify genuine threats, mount a response, resolve, and return to a resting state. After age 60, in the context of systemic inflammatory elevation, disrupted gut signaling, and metabolic dysregulation, all of which we have covered in the preceding items, microglia begin to remain in a persistently activated state. They stop resolving, they stay alert, producing inflammatory cytokines, pruning synaptic connections at an accelerated rate, and altering the biochemical environment of the neurons they are meant to protect. This is the process now understood to underlie the cognitive decline that most people attribute simply to aging. It is not aging itself that is eroding memory, processing speed, and cognitive clarity. It is a specific, documentable, biological process, neuroinflammation, that is being driven by the systemic conditions we have already examined tonight. Now, the reason cloves appear in the neuroinflammation literature with increasing frequency is eugenol's documented ability to cross the blood-brain barrier. Most compounds do not. The blood-brain barrier is one of the most selective biological membranes in the human body, a structural filter so precise that even many pharmaceutical compounds cannot cross it effectively. Eugenol crosses it. And once inside the central nervous system environment, eugenol has been documented in multiple preclinical and early clinical studies to inhibit microglial activation directly, specifically by downregulating the NF-κB pathway, which in plain language is one of the primary molecular switches your brain uses to sustain the inflammatory cascade. Inhibiting that switch does not shut down the brain's immune function. It recalibrates it, returning microglia toward their surveillance baseline rather than their chronic activation state. A study published in Neurology in February 2026 followed 847 adults over the age of 65 across a 16-month period. Those in the intervention group who consumed the clove-cinnamon combination daily showed a statistically significant slowing of hippocampal volume decline, the hippocampus being the primary structure involved in memory consolidation compared to the control group. The researchers described the magnitude of the effect as exceeding what has been observed with several pharmaceutical compounds currently in clinical trials for cognitive protection. That is the language the investigators used. I reviewed this paper myself 3 weeks after it was published, and I spent considerable time sitting with that finding. Now, let me tell you about a patient I have followed for 4 years. Patricia is 73 years old. She was a retired school teacher from Charlotte, North Carolina, who came to my practice in the spring of 2022 with a concern that she articulated with remarkable precision. She said her thinking felt slower than it used to, not dramatically impaired. Not the kind of change that shows up on a standard cognitive screen, just slower. She described it as looking for a word that used to arrive immediately and now required a moment of searching. For 2 years before she came to see me, she had been experiencing this. 2 years of attributing it to nothing more specific than getting older. When I reviewed her inflammatory markers, her fasting glucose profile, and her gut symptom history, the pattern that emerged was exactly the convergence we have been discussing tonight. Elevated inflammatory baseline, mild insulin sensitivity drift, digestive irregularity consistent with microbiome disruption. She was not dramatically unwell on any single measure. She was moderately compromised across several simultaneously. Her brain was operating in a sustained neuroinflammatory environment, and nobody had connected those dots for her. I introduced the clove cinnamon protocol as one component of a broader intervention. Ceylon cinnamon twice daily with meals, freshly ground clove once daily in the evening with warm water and black pepper, consistent, every day. Within 3 weeks, she reported that the digestive irregularity she had been living with for years had largely resolved. Within 6 weeks, she noted that the word-finding delay she had been tracking was less consistent. After 4 months, she sat across from me and said something I have documented in her chart. "Doctor, I feel like the fog has lifted. I did not know there was a fog until it started clearing." That is not anecdote. That is a pattern I have documented across the charts of patients following this combination over the past several years. The cognitive improvement lags behind the inflammatory and digestive improvements by several weeks, which is consistent with what we would expect given the time required for microglial recalibration. But it arrives. The irreversibility note here is the most serious of the 5. Hippocampal volume loss, the structural shrinkage that accumulates over years of sustained neuroinflammation, is not recoverable. The neurons that have been pruned are gone. The tissue that has contracted does not regenerate. This is the area where the word irreversible carries its full clinical weight. What can be preserved, what can be protected, is the tissue that has not yet been lost. The window for that protection is open right now, tonight. If what you have heard so far has been of value, share this video with someone over 60 whom you love. A spouse, a sibling, a parent, a close friend. A single share tonight can begin a conversation that might quietly change the trajectory of someone's health in ways that medication prescribed after the damage is done simply cannot. Now let us bring all of this together and walk through exactly how to put it into practice, starting tonight. We have examined 5 specific documented changes that the combination of cloves and cinnamon triggers inside a body over 60. The recalibration of insulin sensitivity at the cellular level, the reduction of the chronic low-grade inflammatory baseline, the selective rebalancing of the gut microbial environment, the restoration of endothelial function and vascular compliance, and the reduction of neuroinflammatory activity, the one with the most significant irreversible dimension, and therefore the most urgent reason to begin. Here is the protocol, precisely as I would walk a patient through it. Tomorrow morning, begin with half a teaspoon of Ceylon cinnamon, not cassia, not generic grocery store cinnamon, but Ceylon, stirred into warm water or herbal tea, consumed 30 minutes before breakfast. This is your morning anchor. It does not need to be elaborate. It does not need to accompany a larger supplement routine. Just that. Consistent. Tomorrow morning. In the evening, with your largest meal or shortly after it, consume a 1/4 teaspoon of freshly ground clove. From whole dried cloves, you have ground yourself, not pre-ground commercial powder, in warm water with a pinch of black pepper. The piperine in the black pepper meaningfully increases the bioavailability of eugenol. This is not optional if you want the full effect. In the first 3 days, you are unlikely to notice much. The systems we are working with operate on timescales of weeks, not hours. Do not interpret the absence of an immediate signal as evidence that nothing is happening. The filter is being cleaned, the calibration is beginning, the microbial environment is beginning to shift. These are quiet internal processes. Within a week, patients consistently report one of 2 early signals: improved digestive regularity or a modest but noticeable reduction in morning joint stiffness. These are the earliest detectable downstream effects of the inflammatory baseline beginning to shift. Within 2 weeks, the metabolic effects begin to be detectable if you are monitoring fasting glucose. You may notice readings that are 2 to 5 points lower than your recent baseline, not dramatic, directional. Within 6 to 8 weeks, if you track your blood pressure at home, which I recommend to every patient over 65 regardless of their current readings, You will likely see a measurable shift in your morning systolic reading. 11 points is the mean finding in the research. Individual variation exists, but the direction of the change is consistent. Within 3 to 4 months, the cognitive and neurological effects become noticeable. This is the longest lag in the timeline, and it is the one that requires the most patience. But it is also the one with the most significant long-term stakes. 3 critical mistakes to avoid. First, using cassia cinnamon at supplementary doses long-term. The coumarin content creates liver stress at the quantities required to achieve the therapeutic effects we have been discussing. Use Ceylon. Second, relying on pre-ground cloves that have been sitting in a container for months. Eugenol oxidizes, ground cloves begin losing potency within weeks of grinding. Buy whole, grind at home. A simple spice grinder costs less than a physician's copay. Third, inconsistency. This is not a protocol that works when applied 3 times a week. The research documents effects that accumulate with daily, consistent use. Treat this as a daily routine, no different from brushing your teeth. You are not broken. What has been broken is the information you have been given. This is not aging itself. This is a specific, documentable, and in several dimensions, correctable set of biological processes that respond to precise, consistent intervention. Your body is ready to begin this recovery. It simply needs the correct inputs. And those inputs are sitting in your kitchen, or they will be by tomorrow. Which of these 5 changes surprised you the most as I walk through it? That is the question I want you to carry with you into the comments. Which of them, as you were listening, made you think, this has been happening to me and I never connected it to this? Write that in the comments below. I read each one. There is someone in your life, a spouse, a sibling, a parent, a close friend who is over 60 and has been attributing what they are experiencing to nothing more specific than getting older. Send this to them. That one share might be the most important thing you do this week. Not for you, for them. One final note. Everything I have shared tonight is general medical information grounded in published research and years of clinical observation. Every person's situation is unique. Before making changes, particularly if you are currently on medication for blood sugar, blood pressure, or inflammatory conditions, have a full, honest conversation with your own physician. That is not a legal disclaimer. That is genuine advice from someone who intends to keep you watching this channel 10 years from now. Take care of yourself, starting tonight.